Hi, I'm Alethes Sophia, and today I'll be unpacking the SEP entry for Physicalism written by Daniel Stoljar, and you can find the link to the relevant SEP article in the descriptions box below. So first, I'll give a brief introduction of the SEP article and its contents. This article has 6 sections, which I'm going to try to fit into about 15 minutes of video. In order to save time, I won't get into the details of everything that Mr. Stoljar writes, but I will be unpacking all the basics and all the terminology. So here's an overview of the article and what this video contains. The first section is simply to make definitions clear. We don't want to be assigning our own Humpty Dumpty definitions to the words that are being used. In the second section, Mr. Stoljar talks about what sort of big picture needs to be true in order for physicalism as a metaphysical thesis to be true. This concern is called the completeness question, and that's what section 2 is called. And the third section is just a continuation of the second section in the sense that Mr. Stoljar is going to talk about more different kinds of physicalisms. In the fourth section, Mr. Stoljar talks about what different philosophers mean, or what they're referring to when they use the word or concept physical, and this is called the condition question. In the fifth section, he talks about some of the major objections against physicalism in general, and in the sixth and final section, he briefly gives 2 major arguments in defense of physicalism. So section 1 is the basics, and we have a few takeaways here. The first one is that, per Stoljar, physicalism is a metaphysical thesis. It's not epistemological, but metaphysical. What does this mean? It means that physicalism is a thesis about existence and the nature of existence, rather than about what we can know or think or believe about existence and the nature of existence. That latter thing would be an epistemological question. So this isn't included in Mr. Stoljar's entry, but I'll briefly explain what metaphysics is here, because I think this word confuses a lot of people, even some academics. So originally, the word metaphysics is just the title of Aristotle's second volume of a 2-part series that he wrote on the topic of existence and the nature of existence. The first volume he called physics, and the second volume he called metaphysics. So that's basically where this name comes from. So both volumes deal with the same topic, again, which is existence and the nature of existence. So since metaphysics is just the title of a book whose topic is actually existence and the nature of existence, the word metaphysics really just refers to a topic or branch within philosophy that's concerned with existence and the nature of existence. So back to physicalism. The second takeaway in this section is that the word physicalism and materialism are used interchangeably in this article and per Stoljar in academia for the most part. The third and final takeaway from this section is probably the most important one, and it's that the most general physicalist claim is that everything is physical. Everything is physical. As we'll see, physicalism does come in many different varieties, and these may have nuances that add to or modify the main broad claim. Okay, so section 2 is about something called the completeness question. And that means that we're going to be talking about what kind of big picture is implied by physicalism as a thesis. So we start with 2 broad ways to differentiate between varieties of physicalism: supervenience and necessity. Supervenience physicalism says that even if everything ultimately bottoms out in the physical, there are non-physical entities or properties that exist by supervening on the physical as over and above things. To note, over and above entities or properties are considered real, but they're just not physical. And since the non-physical is considered to exist under supervenience, this kind of physicalism is actually a kind of dualism, albeit one that makes the physical fundamental. Some objections to supervenience physicalism target this dualistic aspect, saying that this dualism actually makes it not really a kind of physicalism at all. That's an objection. Another variation is called necessity physicalism, and this adds to the supervenience picture, basically, by requiring that the non-physical, which is over and above, to be necessarily dependent on the physical. And this kind of necessary dependence creates a situation that allows for identity relations to be established between the physical and the non-physical. Under identity physicalisms, there's also 2 kinds, token and type. Token physicalism says that the identity relation between the non-physical and the physical is only for particulars. Okay, what are particulars? Those are non-abstract, non-generic objects like this specific chair or me, Alethes Sophia, as opposed to the idea of chairs or philosophers in general. Type physicalism includes a more general category of properties. So obviously types are going to be abstract or general. And going over more of the jargon, fundamentality physicalism just tries to say that regardless of whatever else might be the case, the physical is fundamental, meaning it has ontological priority or basicness over everything else. And finally, grounding physicalism is more like a view that seeks to be able to explain how the non-physical can come to exist under physicalism. So to note, the grounding notion is distinctly non-causal. This is very important. This non-causality differentiates the grounding relation from other types of identity relations that do require causal dependency of the mental or non-physical on the physical. Section 3 continues to create ways to differentiate between physicalisms, but it's in another section because we're not asking about the completeness question anymore. One consideration that differentiates between physicalisms is whether physicalism must be reductionist or not. Reductionism has to do with something being so basic and fundamental that it can't be explained or analyzed in yet more basic or simpler terms. So if physicalism is reductive, then the non-physical and or mental is explained or analyzed by physical terms, but nothing else can explain the physical except maybe for itself. So for example, the mental experience of pain would be reducible down to C fibers firing in your brain. If the physicalism is non-reductive, then every analysis or explanation doesn't need to reduce down to something physical. And the physical can even be talked about in terms of the mental or non-physical. And doing so doesn't need to imply any kind of ontological fundamentality either way. It could just simply be that the physical and non-physical are different ways of talking about and making sense of the same one thing. This might be a kind of property dualism, for example. Another consideration has to do with something we call truths. So assuming that truth in this article just means true propositions or maybe even necessary knowledge, there's two ways of explaining the way that we come to access these truths. One is a priori and the other is a posteriori. A priori means that we arrive at the necessary truths by means of using purely logic and undeniable or axiomatic principles as premises. And a posteriori means that we arrive at the necessary truths by means of using experience and or empirical observation. Saul Kripke was a philosopher who had a non-reductive sort of physicalism, according to Mr. Stoljar, in which some, quote, necessary truths, end quote, are knowable only a posteriori. However, this is a controversial take, and Mr. Stoljar points out that Kripke's idea of a posteriori necessary truth might be inherently contradictory, so long as one assumes the traditional notion of necessariness and a posteriori. Traditionally, if a truth is said to be necessary, then it's something that's always and exclusively accessed a priori, meaning prior to and obviously without experience. In other words, the only way to arrive at a priori truths is by doing logical analysis. So this means that it doesn't make sense to say that you can non-accidentally know correct logical conclusions purely by means of experience or empirical observation. But this contradiction only happens because of the traditional way of understanding necessity. If this traditional notion of necessity is revised to mean that the strongest form of necessity is rooted in the physical, not in the logical, then a, quote, necessary truth, end quote, can sometimes be a physical fact about the real and actual world. And physical facts about the real and actual world are not true merely in virtue of logic or the laws of logic. Their truth is something stronger and therefore more necessary than even those. So this is what Saul Kripke has done. He has challenged the traditional way of thinking about necessariness in his book called Naming and Necessity. And based on what he said in this book, the strongest kind of necessity would be rooted in the physical, not in the logical. So that means for Kripke, a necessary truth is a physical fact about the real and actual world. And this means that for Kripke, some, quote, necessary truths, end quote, are physical facts, and these can only be known a posteriori, that is, from experience or empirical observation. So if you understand necessity in this revised way, then the initial contradiction that Mr. Stoljar is worried about seems to go away. In section 4, Mr. Stoljar talks about what is being referred to when we use the word physical. This is called the condition question. Mr. Stoljar tells us that there's been two main ways that philosophers have tried to answer this question. One is by defining physicality as any property that's explainable by physical theories, and two is by defining physicality as any property that seems characteristic or essential to physical objects. The problem with both of these is that they're circular. Other problems with trying to define the physical, or in trying to say what exactly that concept refers to, has to do with the fact that our current knowledge of the physical is incomplete or might even be incorrect. So the problem is that it doesn't make sense to try to define something we don't know enough about. This is called Hempel's dilemma. Other ways to try to define the physical include A, thinking that it's an extension of consciousness, or B, that we can only say what the physical is not, but never what it actually is, or C, use the most neutral languages possible, like math or logic, to talk about the physical so that we don't implicitly and unintentionally assign it false qualities, or finally, D, simply to defer to physics and say the physical is just whatever is in accordance with physics knowledge. And obviously there's various problems and or concerns with each of these other options as well. And Mr. Stoljar does go through some of these problems and concerns, but I'm not going to get into those details here. Section 5 is a collection of objections to the physicalist thesis. The first objection is that physicalism fails to explain qualia, which are the qualitative feels of having conscious experiences. The most famous version of this objection comes from Frank Jackson's Mary's Room thought experiment. Another objection is that physicalism doesn't take seriously enough the aspect of intentionality and the meanings that we assign to various things in the world, even though this intentionality plays a very big role in our lives. Another problem with physicalism is that it doesn't quite explain numbers and abstracta, abstracta being things like propositions, concepts, universals, etc. A final objection to physicalism is that philosophy is extremely limited in terms of what we can learn about the physical. And this limits the quality of any theorizing that philosophers might do about the nature of the physical. So the argument there is that philosophers should instead rely more on the work that empirical scientists and physicists do, rather than try to do armchair science. Okay, section 6. This final section briefly gives us two main defenses of the broad physicalist hypothesis. One line of defense is given in light of the concerns having to do with causality. The worry there is that physicalism doesn't seem equipped to be capable of explaining how our intentions, which are non-physical mental events, how these can interact with the physical to cause physical events. The answer to the worry is that supervenience physicalism allows for a special kind of identity relation, possibly, to hold between the mental and the physical. And this allows for all mental events to be ultimately identical with physical events, so that actually it's just going to be physical causing physical, and there's nothing foreign to the physical that's being inserted into the physical causal chain. And so all interactions are still only happening in the realm of the physical. Objections to this account is that the mental event is epiphenomenal, and that just means that it's merely illusory and has no real causal power. And so because mental events are quote-unquote epiphenomenal, it doesn't really form any identity relation with the physical, or it can't. Another objection to this account is that a single outcome can be determined by multiple different causal elements, whether the causal elements are taken together or separately. So that when we try to understand the totality of the world in terms of physical causal chains, it's just too simplistic and doesn't capture everything. The second line of defense for physicalism is that it's the only way for philosophy to not isolate itself and to actually be continuous and coherent with science. So actually, this just means that physicalism seems to be the only rational way for philosophy to continue doing metaphysics. Thank you for watching this video, and if today's video has been helpful to you, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel for more new releases. By the way, Mr. Stoljar does have an email address at the bottom of the SEP entry, so if you have any questions about the article, I think you can email and ask him about it. He's pretty friendly, I think, so he might respond to you if you ask very nicely. You can also ask me if you have any particular questions about the entry, and I can try to answer you, but it won't be as good as Mr. Stoljar himself. Okay, thanks. Bye.